Welcome to the How to Governance podcast by the Into SAI Development Initiative, or IDI. The How to Governance podcast aims to look at the road ahead for public sector governance and the implications for supreme audit institutions, in short, SAIs. In the podcast, we will explore important and upcoming governance topics and new developments, together with exciting guests from and beyond the SAI community. I'd like to emphasize that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. Welcome to IDI's podcast, How to Governance, where we look at the road ahead for SAI governance. In today's episode, we will be focusing on the global environment and what it may entail for SAIs. In an ever more complex and dynamic landscape, what are the major, most critical challenges that SAIs face when it comes to their governance? What are the risks that may be there, and are there also maybe some opportunities for them? What hides really behind terms such as democratic backsliding and fair green transition? And can we finally really measure corruption? These are just some of the big and multifaceted issues that I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss today with my guest, the director of the UNDP Global Policy Center for Governance, Arvin Gadel. Arvin, thank you so much for joining us here today in our podcast studio. Before I ask you to talk about the topics of today, about those big global issues and the work of the Governance Center, I'm sure that our audience will appreciate hearing a little bit more about you, who you are, your background, and what brought you to this position.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. It does feel like a true pleasure and privilege to be part of this podcast episode, not only because these are issues that interest me, but also because I do firmly believe that supreme audit institutions are first-line defenders of our governance systems around the world. And at the moment, it needs defending. So that's why I find it even more important to be here with you today. So my name is Arvin Gadel. I am the director of the UNDP Global Policy Center for Governance. It is a center that is part of the UNDP family of units across the world. We have a presence in more than 170 countries. There are 4 of these global policy centers, and the global policy center that I lead here in Oslo is the one dedicated to what we call frontier governance issues. So these are issues that we think will impact on governance systems around the world, around the corner. So we do research and data analysis on these issues and try to provide guidance and help for our program activities in country, but also for the global policy level. And I came to this job from a career in the Norwegian civil service. I was a diplomat in the Norwegian civil service. I also worked in the NGO sector, and I've been a politician. Which I don't know how that looks from an SAI vantage point, but I think these experiences have shown me also the importance of really trying to understand how these complex governance questions impact on people's lives, and that's why I'm extremely privileged to have this job.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And SAIs, even when they are by definition independent institutions, they are also part and parcel of the public sector in which they operate, and politicians are also part and parcel of that center. So I'm sure that our audience also very much recognizes the need also to interact and to also have the perspectives of politicians when it comes to governance issues and beyond, and how to solve those. But now to the work of the UNDP Global Policy Center for Governance. As the name suggests, this is very closely linked to the topics that we discuss here in our podcast, which is focused on governance. But can you tell us what are the main focus areas? You mentioned that you focus on frontier research, but in which specific governance areas?
So it's important to perhaps zoom out a little bit, because our center is just one part of a bigger whole. And that bigger whole is the international community's investment in a global implementation system that has its decisions made in our global arenas, like the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council and the Security Council. As a result of these decisions, the different UN agencies try to implement action in country, on the ground, on invitation by the government. So we don't we don't choose to do anything by ourselves. We do it on invitation by governments and after mandates given by these global bodies. And United Nations Development Program is the biggest development agency of the United Nations, and it's present in 170 countries. When we started investigating to what extent do we work on governance issues, it was actually quite a interesting finding, because we realized that if you look at the total programming and activities footprint of UNDP, more than half of it has as a core objective to impact on the way that governance structures function or evolve. I think that also brought to the fore, and continues to do so, the need for us to truly understand how do these governance structures, how are they impacted by global trends? What sort of challenges do they face? So our center is a small piece of that effort, but we are particularly charged with trying to explore what we call frontier governance issues. So not necessarily programming issues on a day-to-day level, which our program colleagues in 170 countries deal with, but more what do we think are key issues that will impact on governance systems in the future.
Yes. And so which are the main focus areas that you have then? What are those issues?
Yeah, it's funny that you ask. We're actually in the middle of a conversation across the system to ask our colleagues, what are these challenging things that are coming up on the horizon? And some of them, I'm sure you could have guessed, right? It's about new technologies. It's about, an increasing polarization in the world and how to counteract that. But there are a few things that come out quite clearly. One is almost any country context, the question of how to create a fair green transition, a transition that's not only just in terms of legally just, but also perceived as fair at a time when major economic restructuring needs to happen, and our behaviors need to change. Another issue that's clearly getting a lot of attention is the issue of information integrity, that I think we'll talk about a little bit more afterwards, is this idea that our public conversation is being destroyed by the lack of integrity and truthfulness in that conversation. And third is this idea that fiscal or economic governance and financial integrity is a huge challenge. And I hope we have some time to talk about that later, because I think, to me, this is something we truly need to unpack more, is the connection between the lack of integrity in fiscal and financial systems and the consequences for governance systems. And sometimes, we've at university and potentially also in our work, we've been taught as development practitioners that these are sort of different things. What happens in governance structures is different what happens in fiscal planning or financial planning. But in fact, of course, they are extremely and intimately linked. And there's a very deep recognition of that now. And then maybe finally of these frontier governance issues, which I think is truly exciting and surely also relates to Supreme Audit institutions, is the question about how can democracies deliver on expectation? Because there is a sense, I think, worldwide that perhaps democracies are not actually delivering to expectation. They're not, when people go to the polls and put down their vote in the ballot box, they express very complex things. They express hopes for themselves, as individuals. They express hopes for their family, and they also express hope for their societies. And there is a sense that hope is not being met. And how can our democratic systems evolve to meet those expectations better?
I think this is a key question that let me actually already begin with that one. We use often the term democratic backsliding, and there is quite a lot of data that also shows that overall the world is maybe perhaps not going into the right direction when it comes to level of democracy. The latest VDEM report obviously shows that now there are more autocracies than democracies, or more people live worldwide in an autocratic regime as compared to a democratic regime. But for you, this democratic backsliding, is that something that you see? And obviously, as you said, the implication then for the governance systems and structures that we have, what could those be? And what is the role for SAIs, which are, again, by definition, they should be part and parcel of the governance system, independent, tasked with oversight? Is there something that we need to rethink or redefine when it comes to governance as a whole and when it comes to the role of SAIs?
Do you have a few hours? I mean, I think these are 3 or 4 extremely complex questions, right? I mean, the first one about do we observe democratic backsliding? I think there is very little debate in the academic and practitioner community that there is strong signs of democratic backslidings on key indicators around the world. It is, however, very important to say that this democratic backsliding, while it happens in all sorts of countries, in all sorts of economic, development levels, and all sorts of industrial, structures and economic structures, it is also the case that there are many countries that are not going backwards, but potentially stagnating, and even in some cases improving the democratic, democratic rights. But the big picture is that there is a backtracking on democratic rights and the quality of democratic systems, and of course there are many ways to measure this. There's perception, there is behavior changes, there is of course something that I'm sure you're very familiar with, the extent to which independent state institutions, for example, are put under pressure to do things that they are not necessarily mandated to do, or where their agenda may be impacted in other ways by political design.
Yes.
Now, what does that mean for governance systems? Well, I think what it clearly means is that when a trend occurs of this magnitude and with these deep consequences for governance structures, we have to ask ourselves the question, why? And there is, of course, I think, a very important answer to that is that there is a trust deficit, what we call a vertical trust deficit, the trust between citizens and government. If you look at, generally speaking, 9 out of 10 people in the world prefer democracy as the ideal way of organizing regimes, right? 9 out of 10. But still, we also see when they're put up against specific choices of selecting between candidates that we know are supportive of democratic institutions and candidates that we know are not supportive of democratic processes, more than half will now select those that are not in favor of democratic processes.
And why is that?
So
Do you
that's
have an explanation?
that's the very big question, right? Why is it that still people do prefer democracy over any other system, but they still select leaders that counteract, or so that they don't necessarily combat democratic institutions and processes, but they certainly don't further them. As I said, part of the answer is trust. I think there is, we also have numbers when you look at how people see their own lives. It's incredibly dramatic what's going on. Only 1/3 of the people of the world feel that they have an impact on the governing of their countries. 1/3, and that's pretty serious, right? More than half of people don't feel that they're in control of their own lives, which again is, extremely dangerous numbers. And we also know that a very large number, a majority of the population of the world, feel insecure about the future. And all of these different factors, of course, affect the preferences of people. What do they want to happen? What do they want to see happen in their lives? How do they want their leaders to behave? And the evidence seems to be that while favoring a democratic system, they have many urgent needs and also an experience of not being heard by the democratic system, that they will potentially select leaders that don't support democratic development. So it's all understandable in a way. It's all there's all a logic to it. It's not just a mystery, but it does require us to understand individual people's preferences and how their lives are impacted with this massive universe of insecurity that they're facing.
Can I ask you though, in all this, surely there must be a big role that is played by lack of information integrity, by misuse of data, by manipulating public opinion, of course, through new technologies and so on. That's one of the topics that, of course, you're focusing on. This interaction between influencing the individual's perceptions, the individual's selection of, who they're going to vote for, what they define as their needs, as their priorities. To what extent is that influence? Do you have any data or evidence as to how much is that steered by, misinformation, by lack of integrity in the information that the public is receiving? How is that link as a whole?
We don't have any global evidence or robust statistical evidence on this. There are many different case studies where you do comparative analysis of how people's preferences change, correlating to misinformation prevalence in the information ecosystem, or for other reasons, and therefore you could sort of separate out an effect. But it's inherently a difficult thing to do, right? To measure the impact of people's preferences in response to misleading information. But of course, one of the things that this came truly into focus during the pandemic, and this new term came to life, which was the infodemic, where we could see, and that was of course a very clear indication of how misinformation led to, for example, a lack of rate of vaccination. That's a very specific, statistical, measurable fact, and that showed us that there is an almost immediate impact between, or correlation, or at least covariation between the increase in misinformation and the change in people's preferences and understanding of what is the correct choice. So this is essentially what the Secretary General of the United Nations calls an existential challenge for humanity. And why does he use these big words? Well, it's quite clear. I mean, our societies are fragile things. I mean, the idea that we share, a common base, that we together want to govern each other, is a fragile idea, and really it's no more than maximum 300 years old. Of course, the ancient Greeks and maybe some Eastern and systems also before that had that as an ideal, but as a practiced norm, it's a relatively new thing and a fragile thing. And as a consequence, he saw that when the foundational building block of a well-functioning society, including this question about how we use, allocate, and control power, is information, reliable information. And when that is put into jeopardy, then it does actually constitute an existential challenge and threat to humanity.
Right. And you mentioned that in the introduction to one of the focus themes of the center, you really state that trustworthy and access to trustworthy and reliable information is a necessary condition for well-governed and peaceful societies, right? And again, back here to the role of SAIs. Now, SAIs, at the very core of their mandate, they are tasked in the large majority of countries with verifying the integrity, with verifying the information in the financial statement of the government, of government entities. But then again, against this ever-growing trend for manipulating facts, for presenting misleading information in the public sphere, it almost seems like a tiny drop in the ocean, what SAIs are doing. Is that so? What do you think? Whose responsibility is it then to really uphold the integrity, especially of information and information in the public sphere? And since obviously it then also reflects back on the choices that people make, and then it impacts the very same governance systems that are supposed to regulate, maybe.
I mean, taking one step back, the supreme audit institutions are, there's a reason why they exist in almost every country context in the world, right? They perform an extraordinarily important function in controlling the use of public funds, the quality of administrative processes. This all comes from the Lima Declaration in 1977, of course. Yes. I think that recognition, it needs to be understood more widely, that the role of SAIs and the importance and potential of SAIs. Now, in combating misinformation, SAIs obviously have a role to play in that, sometimes misinformation is perpetrated by authorities. And that in and of itself needs to be in some way at least attempted to be checked or counteracted. And SAIs have an extremely important role to play there. But I also do think that it has a role to play in establishing truth. And now this sounds like big words, right?
All right.
But at the moment, so what forms people's preferences? Well, I think, first of all, it's extremely important that we don't jump to the conclusion that people are stupid or ill-informed, right? We always have to understand how people act. We need to respect and understand their choices and never belittle them. never make them, make them into a caricature of what's reality. And if you give that as a premise, I think that what shapes people's preferences is their assessment of evidence, right? The ability to assess whether evidence is convincing or not. And evidence is either, there's either the strength of evidence or the magnitude of evidence, the amount of evidence that I, as a citizen, is being confronted with. So I'm saying all this just to say that I think effective communication by SAIs on SAI's assessment of what is the truth is extremely important, and it has to go well beyond informing parliamentary committees, right? And cracking that nut could be part of the solution to information integrity challenge, because SAIs is part of this family of ideally independent or necessarily independent state function institutions, and together these institutions, also for example in the kind of institution we work with a lot, national statistics offices is another example of that. Their ability to communicate effectively what they assess as truth independently will help counteract disinformation. But it's not a silver bullet, and SAIs alone cannot do this. But recognizing that each and every SAI and each and every SAI staff who's listening to this podcast has a responsibility for the broader definition of what is the origin of truth. Is it your TikTok feed, or is it a independent public institution?
This is a very important call for action, I would say, for SAIs and SAI staff around the world. But I want to ask you mention and you talk about the information ecosystem, and now you also mentioned the statistical offices, SAIs. We talk often also about the accountability ecosystem, where we also see what is the role of civil society organizations, what is the role of media when it comes to not just upholding information integrity, but also, of course, when it comes to accountability, broadly speaking. And then there are other, of course, institutions like the Ombudsman's Office, anti-corruption bodies in some cases. Are those two similar concepts, information ecosystems and accountability ecosystems? What do you mean by the information ecosystem?
First of all, I think it is an attempt to understand or put a name on what is a much more complex information situation, right?
Yes.
When I was a kid in the 80s, it was an easy communication situation where I would or my parents would switch on the news in the evening and get their information, and in a way citizens would write to the newspaper and share information or put a ballot in the ballot box, and in that way also share information. It's relatively easy. Of course, I'm simplifying, but it was relatively easy compared to the systems that we have now. And I use the word system deliberately because I think there's also an understanding that the information ecosystem has particular drivers, incentives, and rewards that sort of manifests itself in a continuation of a system, of a balance. So this sounds very complicated, but the idea is that there is a lot of different actors that are working together, either in collaboration or in competition, to reach the consumer of that information. And that is happening in a much more complex and targeted way than ever before. I sometimes think of it in this way, that in the old days, we talked about mass communication. There were even degree programs on mass communication.
True,
right?
that.
But now that's an irrelevant concept. I think what's more relevant is communication to the masses, in the sense that communications can be tailored specifically to specific individuals or groups of people to an extent that they know that that the people who are designing this, that they know that they have a high success rate in terms of pickup. So they use less, in a way, less energy to reach people, as they are tailoring the information much more specifically, and people then pick it up and often don't have access to diverging opinions or diverging informations. I would say that the information ecosystem term is useful to the extent that it conveys that information is exchanged and shared in a way that is much more complex than it used to be. And we need to understand these drivers and incentives that make that information exchange happen.
Mm-hmm. And here I want to bring back again what you mentioned before about SAIs and the importance of SAIs communicating beyond Parliament and beyond, what is their legal obligation in terms of the findings of their audits. We see that there is still a lot of untapped potential when it comes to SAIs really being proactive in raising issues to media, to civil society, in actually becoming a part of the public discourse, and also even maybe in some cases driving the public agenda, because of course also of independence concerns and of maybe some inherent fears to put the spotlight on the institution of the SAI. But how do you see that? How do you see SAIs overall as part of the governance system, the way you see it right now? And also, of course, considering the challenges that we've been talking about. We talked about democratic backsliding. We talked about lack of trust in government. We talked about mistrust, misinformation as a whole.
Again, lots of questions in there, but I think generally speaking, in a way, the work of an SAI, one of the success criteria is that there is friction, right? Because an SAI is, if successful, is able to effectively and efficiently uncover mismanagement, and that I think. It always generates friction and opposition. The question now is to what extent is the type of reactions that SAIs are experiencing around the world just a normal friction or disagreement with the SAI findings and conclusions, or an attempt of limiting SAI's ability to act. And I think, it's quite clear that SAIs, we have some specific, spectacular examples of attempts to basically completely demobilize SAIs. Mm-hmm. That's quite recent. And I think that, tells us a broader story, that the fact is that, SAIs are facing incredible opposition at the moment, and they need a lot of support. Now, what is the role of SAIs in communicating and engaging in this broader public conversation about trust and governance? I mean, I think it's complicated in the sense that perhaps the most important thing is to stay true to the mandate that SAIs have. Strictly speaking, very of personal opinion here, I think that while I do understand that there is a drive to more compliance and performance audit type activities in SAIs, and there's a lot of value in that, I think that these are the kind of audits that can really unlock the imagination of people, truly help people understand why governance systems don't work the way they should, but they can also jump to conclusions that may not fully appreciate the full political picture, maybe not fully, the moment you get into performance audits, it's difficult and challenging waters to navigate. So my sense is that I would advocate at the moment for ambitious SAIs in that getting into, as they have been doing all over the world, development agendas of governments, trying to understand the actual agendas and truly assess how the work is going, but making sure to emphasize what is the core mandate of SAIs. And in those cases where one goes not beyond the mandate, but where one assesses things, especially in performance audits, that some may think are outside of an auditor's purview, it needs to be very explicitly explained why it is not, why it is a part of the purview. That was a long answer, but I do think that there is a trust paradox or dilemma, right? To what extent do SAIs build trust, or to what extent can they contribute to removing trust from the system? Sometimes removing trust is the exact role of the SAI. And trust is not always positive. Trust can be absolutely destructive if the trust is misguided. Mm-hmm. And SAIs can help guide that trust. But I do think it's important that SAIs are even more aware of how their communication is picked up by people outside of parliamentary and government circles. because I think quite often it can be construed as a way by opposition or a way by other factors or actors to, in an unreasonable way, construct an argument for distrust that doesn't actually fit with findings. So it's a very hard and difficult balance, and that's why I have so much respect for SAIs, because they have to navigate this all the time. But I think just being sure that it always goes back to basic. What is the core role of SAIs, and how can that be best executed?
It's interesting because many SAIs have in their mandate much more than just financial audit, much more, including, in some parts of the world, the audits of political party funding, which you can immediately, I'm sure, appreciate can be a very challenging task.
Yes.
Audits of the personnel income statements of politicians, another thing that some SAIs have in their mandate. So the mandate often is a lot more than just the financial audit, and then it becomes very
I had to visit the
difficult.
Ugandan SAI at some point. This is many years ago, so I can say this now. And I remember I was going to sign the visitor's book, and I was looking at the visitor book and saying, "Oh wow, the last visitor was 7 months ago." And then she said, "Well, we don't really have many friends," and I thought that was was an interesting take on affairs. Of course, that it's not the SAI's role to make friends, but joke aside, I think performance audits are extraordinarily important, and I think SAIs definitely to do it. I mean, I was just looking at the numbers now recently of how many countries, how many SAIs have been doing some sort of audit on COVID response measures.
Yes,
I mean, it's
exactly.
just almost every SAI has done it. And it's not been strictly financial audits, not even strictly compliance audits. These have been, also performance audit. And I think that's been extremely important, super important, and of course very challenging. But it does, the ability, and I think also this came from this Rio meeting, right? That, there needs to be a response to crisis. SAIs are not only, in a way, reactive institutions. They have to be ahead of the trends. And therefore, in order to do that, you sometimes need to use other tools than financial audits and go into more performance audit, forward-looking type audit instruments. So, I mean, I think my point is not that SAIs shouldn't go into performance audits at all. I mean, I think it's also, for example, development plans. There's a lot of SAIs that are creating very constructive dialogues and debates around development on the back of their work on auditing development plans, and I do think that that's extremely important. But my point is really that it's being aware of the impact just shouldn't mean being aware of the communication impact of these audits shouldn't mean being more risk averse. It's just simply being able to have a more explicit understanding and management of risk. And of course, that costs money and time, and I know that that's scarce, but I do think that's part of the answer to your question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And indeed, risk management is overall a topic that's receiving a lot of attention among SAIs. The risk of issues related to the reputation of the SAI, that's always a big risk. There are also risks related to independence, which are
Of course,
growing, unfortunately. But overall, it is a very important area, and unfortunately one that I would say still a bit underdeveloped across SAIs, together also with the function of external communication and stakeholder management as a whole. You mentioned the Ugandan example and them saying they don't have many friends, but who do you think are the friends of SAIs in let's say the current governance systems that we are observing, and maybe who should become the friends of SAIs going forward?
It's a good question. I do think that it's very important that as the role of SAIs is acknowledged in international agreements. For example, I do think now next year there's the financing for development process that is going to ideally quite fundamentally reform the way that we finance our road towards reaching the sustainable development goals. And I think it's incredibly important that, for example, in an international framework like that, there is a recognition of the independence and the role of SAIs around the world.
Can you explain a bit more for our audience what
Sure.
actually will happen next year?
Okay.
What are we anticipating?
So what we do know is that there's a $4 trillion annual gap in the financing needs from reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and it's probably more by now, actually. And that's why the international community comes together regularly to assess how our mechanisms for financing development are working and whether they need to improve. There's been 4 such conferences in the last 22 or 3 or 4 years. 3 of them, and there is a 4th one that's coming in 2025 in June, July in Spain, and it's called the Financing for Development 4 Conference. And ideally, this conference will set out a ambitious agenda for reform of the international financial system, reform of public financing systems on a national level, or looking at trade systems, debt management systems, and all of these different areas is relevant for SAIs. I mean, look, for example, at debt. I mean, we know that I'm sure 60-70% of SAIs around the world have done some sort of debt assessment.
Yes,
in
they do.
in the recent years, right?
Correct.
And when the international community have a foundational conversation about how to organize the systems of credit and debt among countries, the role and function of SAIs should be a critical part of that. So who should be the friends of SAIs? I think at least these international processes need to truly bring SAIs to the center of affairs, because in many countries, as you know better than anyone, it's hard to find national friends. Therefore it's very good to have international friends, and these international frameworks need to support SAIs. But beyond that, I do think that when we need to reinvent the way that democracy works and functions, because as I said, there is a fundamental unhappiness about the way that democratic systems are delivering. And delivery is a key thing here, key word here, right? People are essentially interested in how their lives get better. And if you don't have an independent assessment of that and only rely on government's own story, or for that matter, a selection of citizens' own assessment, it will not be possible to evolve or create better systems. That's why SAIs are going to have to be a critical solution to what I think will be, let's call it, next generation democratic systems. Exactly how that next generation democratic system is going to look, I don't know, but I know that SAIs will play a role in it.
This is a very hopeful and optimistic view, at least when it comes to the role of SAIs in the future, because sometimes when you look at the data, when you see indeed the fact that SAIs struggle and experience continuous attacks on their independence, on their work, on their reputation, the heads of SAIs personally get attacked, in media, through government and so on. It can sometimes paint a bit of a bleak picture in terms of the role of SAIs and the future of SAIs. But I'm very happy that you see this differently and that you see that there is a space in, let's say, a future
Can I say this? Because you will have many listeners, I'm sure, who are probably genuinely afraid for themselves and their institution right now. And the mandate of the institution. So, of course, I'd just like to say that, yes, there are a lot of reasons to think that the current system is in jeopardy. But our history tells us one thing very clearly, is that democratic evolution happens in waves. And these waves are, if we judge by the last 250 years, they will come again. And right now, also we have to remember that we had 30 years of democratic positive evolution across the planet. Now, there is a dip, and we have lost a lot of ground. But there is no reason at all to not prepare for when the next wave comes and a new, strong democratic reality becomes a norm again. And for that to happen, you need strong SAIs. I honestly do believe that strong SAIs are an essential ingredient to this new wave that has to come, a new sort of resurgence of democracy. That's no consolation for those who feel threatened themselves or where they see their institution is threatened. But in the face of insecurity, it's easy to become a little bit myopic and focus on the right here and right now. And I think that's the right thing to do. You need to deal with the crisis, whether it's crisis of, as you say, reputation or mandate or other things. But please to try to keep in mind that if history is anything to go by, this will at some point turn. And making sure that the SAIs are ready for that turn. And I think many SAIs are already thinking in that direction. How do we need to evolve? What new technologies do we need to use? How do we need to, how can we better safeguard our mandate and independence? These questions, need to be actively answered every day.
And this is precisely also what we try to explore here in the podcast. What are the ways to future-proof the governance of SAIs and SAIs as part of the broader governance system? Because it's interesting, when we speak about governance, oftentimes in the context of our work, we really look more into the management of the organization, into how the SAI as an institution interacts with the rest of the public sector, but we don't really look into governance overall as the whole complex set of written and unwritten rules and so on, which are currently dictating or currently determining what is happening in the public sphere and also how it's influencing citizens.
But Davina, I'm sure you're right, but I also think you're wrong, because there are very few places in the public system where you will be more confronted with let's call it the direction of a regime than in an SAI. So, yes, you are rightfully concerned about the management and the governance of SAIs and their relationship with Parliament and government and all of these things. But I think it's and this is why Inter-SAI IDI is so incredibly important, is that attention to patterns of behavior change by governments and understanding what that means, not only for the SAI as an independent institution, but for a society as a whole. You may be the first warning bell that rings, right? When the government decides to clamp down on an SAI report or process, maybe that's the first warning bell that things are going in the wrong direction. So in that way, you may not be actively, talking about it in a structured way as part of your mandate, but although I think many are, but I think you may actually be among the most important vantage points for understanding this development.
No, sure, that is completely correct. It's just more of a conceptual, let's say, difference when we say we work on governance issues in the IDI. Usually, then we mostly look into organizational and management type of aspects, but obviously also we are very much concerned and exploring also what is happening more broadly. But now I would like us to zoom in on one of the topics that you mentioned at the beginning also, and that is financial integrity, anti-bribery, which is an area that you're looking into, anti-corruption as a whole. Can you share with us what are your current findings, observations in terms of what's the state of affair worldwide when it comes to that? And again, SAIs, and where do they fit in here? Financial integrity?
There are many ways to talk about this, right? Financial integrity, I think, again, is a term that I recommend people to try to explore, because it is something that goes over and beyond and deeper than the assessment of corruption. There's a UN panel report from something called the FACTI panel, FACTI, which I recommend everyone to have a look at, the FACTI report. Which defines financial integrity as a system of values, as well as as a system of managing money and funds and interests. So have a look at that, because I do think actually, in fact, all SAIs should try to incorporate these ideas into the way that they work. Now, the big picture, it's interesting that you asked this now, because I think we are in the middle of a recognition that despite 30 years of anti-corruption work around the world, it is a stubborn thing. And in fact, corruption levels seem to be more or less at the same level. So yes, bribery, we can see some sense of, bribery numbers are slightly going down. There are all sorts of discussions of why that's happening. Some say that it may be because of digitalization of payments. Some say that there may be other reasons for it. But I do think that, the bigger picture is still quite fascinating and, of course, depressing, which is that all of this anti-corruption effort has seemingly not necessarily worked. Of course, it's impossible to write a contrafactual story. I mean, what would have happened if there wasn't any any anti-corruption work? Would our corruption levels be much higher? I think they would have. So it's not like they haven't worked. It's just that we still are at a really dangerously high level of corruption around the world. And some some estimates tend to put this in terms of proportion of GDP, global GDP, and
around 30%, I think.
Well, depending on how you measure it, but at least these are staggering numbers.
Yes.
And of course, the reason why this is important is not only because the money that are disappearing and are not being productively allocated, and capitalism doesn't work in the way it should as a result, and markets don't function the way they should, but it's also because the perception of corruption and the actual corruption in itself is like poison to society, right? It destroys and not only vertical trust, so the trust between citizens and their governments, but also horizontal trust. We see these things are connected. And if I can bring us back to that trust point just briefly, because it does connect to the financial integrity, is that, at the moment, we are recording some of the lowest trust numbers, the horizontal trust numbers that we've ever recorded. Generally speaking, 30% of the population of the world trust other people. 30%. I mean, for me, that is perhaps the most scary statistics of them all. It even beats, how scary those corruption numbers are. Because, corruption, is a transactional thing in that it has a function. Of course, we don't think it's a good function, but it has a function. The lack of and it makes, economic activity can happen as a result of it. It's misguided, it's unfair, and it's irregulated, and all of those things. But but the problem with a level of mistrust at the level that I just talked about now is that it even ruins possibilities of, within innovation, for example. I mean, if you can't trust someone, you don't want to sign a contract with them, right? So basic transactional relationships will break down, and basic human relationships break down. And as a result, it's extraordinarily damaging. I think and we also know that, corruption and financial integrity, or lack of financial integrity, is probably the most effective governance killer there is. And we haven't properly taken that to heart, is my feeling.
But how is that possible? Because we have been talking about corruption, and we have been, as you said, prioritizing efforts to combat corruption for so many years now. Why is it so difficult? Is it because of this lack of trust between people? Is that what is driving it? Why is it so stubborn? Why is it so persistent, in your view?
So, in my view, I think there are many reasons for it. One thing is, what a professor when I went to university had told me in the first class. He said, if you're not able to sympathize with the people that benefit from the bad thing, you would never understand the bad thing. So if you don't understand why people are corrupt and you don't put yourself in those shoes, it's very hard to understand why corruption happens. And I believe that the incentives to uphold this system, which is not a national system, right? It's very important to remember that, we keep thinking of corruption as a national issue, but I don't think, except for even petty corruption, has some sort of link to an international, transboundary, transnational system of illicit money and illegal money. And this system is held up by an incentive structure which is extremely strong. And it's very, very hard to change. So I'm not saying that all national level corruption, petty corruption comes from the international level, but I'm saying that without solving the transboundary, illicit financial flows issues, it's going to be much, much harder to deal with the national level petty corruption.
And here, back to SAIs. SAIs are national institutions. They, of course, have a role to play in anti-corruption efforts, even though I also have to say that depending on their mandate, depending on the way they're structured, that role can be different, because in some cases they can only detect cases, but they cannot follow up. It's up to other agencies, other, of course, institutions to prosecute, to investigate further. So sometimes SAIs also see their role much more into the detection stage and not really then the follow-up. But they are national institutions.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a major challenge, right? I mean, we have, there is more and more collaboration among financial intelligence units across borders to try to unpack and investigate and even try to jointly bring cases to court. That does happen to a greater extent than before, but not to the extent that probably is needed. SAIs have an explicitly national mandate, but I do think that while there is a limitation there, I think, for example, the work that InterSci IDI does and InterSci generally does, which is the peer-to-peer learning processes, the ability to learn from each other methods. I mean, you're not doing criminal investigations, but you're doing investigations and audits into both processes and outcomes of those processes. And I think making sure that the best possible tools are being applied, the best possible understanding of the context is being applied, so you can enrich others' understanding of context, and through that also create deeper insight of what are the actual incentive structures at work here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it is a foundational challenge for SAIs that the national mandate stops at the border, obviously. But I'm not, that may be, in a way a question back to IDI. I think at some point this question needs to be asked. If we cannot handle this global system of corruption and illicit money, which impacts heavily on public financial management systems, then perhaps we need to look at the way that SAIs are able to work also cross-border.
There is a lot of good examples on coordinated audits, on joint audits, and also on peer-to-peer learning, as you say, and joint efforts when it comes to anti-corruption. But ultimately, of course, when it comes to then the follow-up, the prosecution, as you say, there might be some positive trends in terms of also that joint cross-border follow-up, and but it's still, I think, a long way to go, especially also in many of the contexts in which we operate in the developing country context. I think that is still a bit outstanding. You can see it more in Europe, I guess, but maybe not so much.
But
otherwise.
I think this should serve as inspiration for
exactly.
For the people who are listening to this podcast, and also for the community, InterSci community generally, is that there is a lot of scope and space for innovation. And I sense that the international community really they want to try to get to this in a more in a more structured way. How do we kill this system of illicit finance? And SAIs, individual SAIs can start breaking ground with innovative collaborations across borders if they want to, right? Whether that's information exchange or peer-to-peer. And I think there will be a lot of appetite to learn from those experiences. Because I feel that the policy environment around this is shifting. And it's also connected to the Financing for Development conference we talked about next year, is that there is a sense, and in fact I just saw that there may be even some concerted initiatives and moves towards, for example, handling what we call professional enablers of illicit financial flows. So,
what is that?
Yes, they do exist. Well, there are certain professional groups that are almost always involved in the illicit either acquisition of, movement of, or storing of illicit funds. And these are I'm generalizing here, but they are basically bankers, accountants, and lawyers, right?
Okay.
And these three professional service providers, or as they also are called, are often they have to be part of this system. And some of them, they have protections. For example, there's a client lawyer privilege, which has to do with not sharing information with authorities on that relationship, which limits the information and availability of information for those units of authority that are supposed to unpack these illicit flows. So, and there are other reasons why these professional enablers do what they do, and of course, including what I just talked about, incentive structures that are very strong. There's lots of money, lots to gain, and operating in the gray zones is profitable. And but this Financing for Development conference next year, I hope anyway, is going to make some strides in the direction of getting to terms with that. Saying that these are not just independent professional groups that work isolated in national context. They are connected by a specific set of incentives and networks and collaborations that make these illicit flows possible.
Yeah. So it's again a truly global challenge that we're trying to solve. We're coming towards the end of our podcast, and I have just a couple of more questions for you. The first one is related to a report you published earlier this year, linked to the progress on the indicators related to SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And the title of this report strikes me quite much, because it said it's called At the Crossroads: Breakdown or Breakthrough on Peace, Justice and Inclusion. What hides behind this title? Why breakdown or breakthrough?
We use that sentence because the Secretary General also talks about this moment of breakdown or breakthrough in the multilateral system. So in the system of the international community, how if we don't deal with these joint problems and these joint trends that are damaging the way that we as human beings relate to each other and our societies, then and damaging the prospects of development, then we face breakdown. But if we manage to harness new technologies, make sure that we charge at the opportunities that are there and work together, that could be a breakthrough. Now, SDG 16 is the Sustainable Development Goal 16, one out of 17 goals. This particular goal has peace, justice, and strong institutions, as you say, as a key focus. And it's quite special in that it's really the only one that explicitly take into account governance factors or indicators, including corruption.
Yes.
What does it hide? Well, basically behind that title is, of course, a very bleak picture. That doesn't surprise people. I mean, generally three main takeaways. One is there is a fundamental lack of inclusion in our governance systems. Only 1 out of 4 parliamentarians are women, for example. 1 out of 6 people experience severe discrimination. This is much worse also for those with disability, which is a billion people on this planet. And there's a lot of distrust to decision-making systems. As I say, 1/3 of the people in the world feel that they can impact on those systems. A second finding, broadly speaking, is that it is an unsafe world. We are in a situation where the homicide rate, for example, are not decreasing to the extent that we would have expected them or wanted them to do. There's still more than 500,000 people being killed every year in homicides. Civilian deaths in crisis are increasing by 70% from last year to this year, and probably even more next year. And there are a number of other reasons, for example, gender-based violence, which is going in the wrong direction. And then finally, a takeaway is on organized crime, which is, of course, connected to the others as well. But we see organized crime in a broader sense, again, connecting to this illicit financial flows and the international financial systems that allow this money to move, is in many regions of the world is taking hold. It's getting quite dangerous because of organized crime, and I'm not only talking about gangs and violence of the sort of most obvious kind. I'm talking about complex, sophisticated criminal structures that allows for everything from human trafficking to embezzlement of public funds. So that all tends to break down, right?
Yes, but are there some glimmers of hope in that?
There are, of course. I mean, I think, first of all, I think there's a sense that, we talked about bribery before. Bribery numbers are going down, and it's fascinating why that's happening. It's a slight decrease, but what's important here is that the trend is broken, and I think that should give us a sense of hope. There also, we see specific movements in specific countries. We actually published a report where we published a set of examples of how countries are working either to include women in decision making, to improve public financial management systems, to include people with disability better. So while the aggregate picture is quite dark, I have to say that when we started exploring specific examples of dealing with these issues, it's so exciting. There's so much innovation going on in our governance systems around the world. So many real, progress areas in specific contexts. But the bigger picture doesn't look very good.
But let's hang on also to those glimmers of hope, those positive examples of innovation as well. And still, I would hope that we can keep a bit of an optimistic perspective still, of course, despite and against this quite complex and challenging global situation that we're facing. And thank you very much also for outlining all those risks, all those trends that we need to be mindful of, and especially from the SAI perspective. Arvin, as always, we want to end by asking you for some final words of wisdom. As we have established, we live in a world where democratic backsliding is on the rise, where the legitimacy and the independence of SAIs as watchdogs of financial integrity, as guarantors of accountability, of transparency is under threat. What would be your advice on how SAIs should safeguard, reinforce, and maybe even redefine their role in the global governance landscape?
Thanks so much for that, Defina. I think the most important thing is to recognize that SAIs are first-line defenders of the democratic governance systems around the world. Extremely important mandate. It should be motivating enough by and of itself, and especially at this time when we know we are still waiting for the next wave of democratic progress. But let me try with 5 C's. Okay, this is just to try to make it as comprehensible as possible. All of my complicated thoughts about this, which I don't sometimes think myself I don't fully understand, but let me try. So for the first point for me is make sure to collaborate. Collaborate with each other across SAIs, because when the storm comes and the waves are tall, you need to be able to hedge your bets, connect with others, safeguard your interests. And that is best done by connecting and collaborating across borders. Second, cooperate with other independent state function institutions, because they will be experiencing more or less the same thing. Now, what sort of strategies you deploy as SAIs is probably also conditioned on what sort of strategies other independent state institutions deploy. And making sure that you're aware of each other's experiences and also learn from each other is important. Third C, consolidate. Make sure that you are full of confidence and full of energy when you're inside your mandate, and be explicit about the mandate. Sometimes when you explore gray zones, I would say, and be clear about why you're exploring gray zones and why you may be moving in other direction or explorative areas in explorative ways of auditing. But consolidating, making clear for everyone what is the mandate and why the mandate is as it is extremely, extremely important. Capacitate, use new technologies, because we know that it can make the work of SAIs extremely efficient. Success rates are increasing, and we even see in some cases that adopting artificial intelligence not only increases success, but increases attention and therefore also funding to SAIs, and therefore also more room for maneuvering. And then finally, communicate. Communicate better with people. Normal people, they need to understand what SAIs are, and don't make it a fringe business, make it a core business. Yes, of course, the most important thing is to inform parliamentary bodies about what findings of the audits are, but make sure that as important is the communication with people generally. build a strategy for it, learn from others, and make sure and test whether the messages that you want to deliver to people is taken up by people.
Arvin, thank you so much for these final words of wisdom. So coordinate, cooperate, consolidate, communicate, and capacitate.
Yes.
Maybe not in that order, but still. Thank you very much. This has been very insightful, and it has been a real pleasure having you as a guest on our podcast.
Thank you so much, Safina.